So, the Phantom Liberty expansion and the 2.0 reboot are being celebrated, as if CD Projekt Red has finally achieved their long-awaited redemption arc for the Cyberpunk 2077 franchise, and have turned around their company brand and the base game's reputation after the disastrous launch back in December of 2020. But I disagree, because there's a huge asterisk next to this so-called redemption arc. And after 3 grueling years of damage control, patches and hot fixes, CDPR developers have rolled out the Cyberpunk 2077 expansion, and a reboot that certainly looks technically superior to the original base game in a variety of ways, like over 20 new gameplay mechanics, 3 new story arcs, new characters, new themes in the spy thriller genre, and over 100 new items, vehicles, cyberware and weapons, and a laundry list of upgrades and enhancements. But it still seems CDPR as a company has learned very little from its past mistakes. And yeah, we're all hype and excited to see the improvements and new features, but there's still something missing. Something that should have been an obvious addition given the history of the game and the developer, and that is the absence of a new Game Plus mode. So here are the top 5 reasons why I believe CDPR's failure to deliver a new Game Plus mode for the Cyberpunk 2077 reboot and expansion is a complete and epic fail. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for the latest Cyberpunk 2077 news, secrets, leaks, and updates. Number 5. The Lost Hours in the Witcher Paradox. The main storyline of the original Cyberpunk 2077 can be completed in an average of 25 hours, according to a study of player data from the website howlongtobeat.com. where they've analyzed how long it takes to beat Cyberpunk 2077 based on aggregated player statistics. But this number only scratches the surface, because when factoring in the additional time it takes to play through the game's side quests, experience the multiple endings, and engage with random NPCs and other activities, players can easily log close to 100 hours of playtime to experience the full content of Cyberpunk 2077. So knowing that players invested a massive amount of time in building up their characters and skills, weapons and equipment, a new Game Plus mode would have respected and honored the investment of time from existing players, who were hoping they could have carried their progress over to the 2.0 reboot and the Phantom Liberty expansion. In the absence of a new Game Plus mode in Cyberpunk 2077's Phantom Liberty expansion and the 2.0 reboot is definitely not a good look for CD Projekt Red. And given the history of CDPR developers releasing base games filled with bugs and performance issues, I believe the lack of a new Game Plus feature for Cyberpunk 2077 totally disrespects the time and effort players have invested into their original game. What's even more interesting is when you compare Cyberpunk 2077 with The Witcher 3, where CDPR developers spent months instead of years at a time, doing patch updates on The Witcher 3 to stabilize the game after a disastrous launch as well. But there's a huge difference. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt received its new Game Plus feature as a free update in August 2015. Which wasn't 3 long years of wait time, it was a short few months after the game's original release. And with the new Game Plus mode, players were able to restart the game and transfer many of their character and equipment progressions. And just like Phantom Liberty, The Witcher 3's expansion scaled up the difficulty of the game mechanics to make it more challenging for players. And yes, we know that the other Witcher 3 expansions like Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine did not at all have individual new Game Plus modes, but they were still fully compatible with The Witcher 3's existing modes for the new Game Plus. This means that if you were already playing the main story under the new Game Plus mode, you could continue into these expansions with all your carried over builds, skills and abilities. And if you started the expansions in the regular game, then players could decide to play them again under the new Game Plus feature after completing the regular storyline. So a lot like the Phantom Liberty DLC, The Witcher 3 expansions were just as transformative and also added new storylines, new characters, plus new gameplay mechanics. Hearts of Stone was released in October 2015 and added about 10 hours of additional gameplay. And Blood and Wine was released in May 2016 and was even more extensive, offering around 20 hours of additional content. And just like the Phantom Liberty expansion, Blood and Wine introduced entirely new locations to explore. This approach was well received by both critics and players because it added significant replay value to the game. It also strengthened the bond between CD Projekt Red and the gaming community, and it also set a precedent for what players should expect from CD Projekt Red for post-launch support and additional content. And this makes the absence of a new Game Plus feature for Cyberpunk 2077 all the more noticeable and all the more punishing to the CDPR brand. Number 4. The Mass Effect of a Broken Brand. players have invested hundreds of hours into their character builds, meticulously crafting skill trees, acquiring specialized gear, and making narrative choices that define their version of V in Cyberpunk 2077. But with no New Game Plus mode, all that investment is basically dead on arrival after the 2.0 reboot and the Phantom Liberty expansion are released, because players will be forced to start from scratch and abandon all the progress they made from the base game. And considering the new DLC content is designed to integrate into the base game's existing storyline, having a New Game Plus mode that'll allow pre-existing players to access the Reboot and the Phantom Liberty content while transferring their previous progression builds is once again a missed opportunity by CDPR to further restore their brand. And also, I believe it's a basic misunderstanding of what makes RPGs compelling to the player, which is the value and weight of choice, and how those choices push the character forward over the duration of the game. For example, the Mass Effect games by BioWare set a gold standard for character progression and choice consistency across multiple games. Players could carry over their character in Commander Shepard, along with their decisions, relationships, and some aspects of character progression from one game to the next. This was a core feature that BioWare heavily advertised and produced for their players, and the result was consistent and emotional story and character arcs that spanned across multiple games. BioWare understood the essence of RPGs is in the player's ability to choose and face the consequences of those choices. And by allowing cross-progression, BioWare made each decision in each game feel impactful. And not just in the immediate context but in the overarching narrative. And this is all what made the Mass Effect series a gold standard in video game storytelling. It fostered a dedicated community of fans who were deeply invested in the Mass Effect universe, something that players still talk about years after the original trilogy ended. And it contributed to the series' critical acclaim and long-term commercial success. Now let's compare this with CDPR's missed opportunity to include a New Game Plus mode, and offer cross-progression for both the Phantom Liberty expansion and the 2.0 reboot, where this decision forces players who have invested hundreds of hours in the base game to start from scratch in the updated content that'll make their previous efforts completely irrelevant. And for a company that's already walking on thin ice due to past controversies, this is a risky move that could alienate a significant portion of their player base. Projekt Red has built its reputation on delivering RPGs that are rich in choice-driven elements, as evidenced by their commitment to the Witcher series. And so the absence of a New Game Plus mode for the expanded and rebooted content is completely against CDPR's brand identity. So either this is a lack of understanding of their own market position or a willingness to compromise on their own values. And the long-term implication could be a permanent loss of faith and trust as a game developer, when they used to have a reputation for understanding and respecting the gaming community. And it's because of this that gamers might think twice before investing their time and money into future products from CD Projekt Red, especially now that they know that their investment might not be completely respected. Number 3. Phantom Penalty, new game mechanics from a broken engine. CDPR heavily marketed Cyberpunk 2077 as a deeply immersive and choice-driven RPG, and that your character's decisions and actions, playstyle and development would significantly impact the storyline. Plus, most of the promotional material and interviews leading up to the base game's release emphasized that V would be a character who evolves based on the player's choices over a massive storyline. And since the Phantom Liberty expansion is an extension of that sprawling storyline, it's counterintuitive for CDPR to then turn around and penalize players, after they literally bought into the promise that Cyberpunk would be a game that'll evolve with their character. And this means all the time and effort players spent over the past 3 years to develop their character were absolutely meaningless. Plus, this will completely contradict the initial promises made by the company. And from my perspective, it seems CDPR is more interested in distancing itself from the base game's tarnished reputation than in honoring the time and effort invested by its early adopters and most loyal players. It's indeed a calculated move to shift the narrative towards the new and improved versions of the game, but it comes at the cost of penalizing and alienating those who have supported the company during its most challenging times. So players who have invested hundreds of hours in the base game are now faced with the prospect of starting from scratch, just to experience features that many believe should have been part of the original release. And there's many players who feel this is an undeserving penalty for their loyalty. And even though the Steam platform is showing positive growth and satisfaction for Cyberpunk 2077 as an improved game, CD Projekt Red as a company is still stuck in the quicksand of lost confidence and trust, where many still feel that CDPR hasn't improved their company practices at all. And I believe the decision not to include a New Game Plus mode for Cyberpunk will have long-term consequences on CDPR's brand and future sales. This not only hurts enthusiasm for the new content, but also will lead to potential declines in active player numbers and community involvement. Another major problem for CD Projekt Red was their insistence to build the Cyberpunk 2077 properties on their proprietary Red game engine, which clearly lacked the capabilities needed for an open-world game with the size and complexity of Cyberpunk 2077, and those vulnerabilities weren't fully exposed until the original game's release. Even though The Witcher 3 was built on the Red game engine, there were significant differences in their development. Scope and complexity. Cyberpunk 2077 was far more complicated than the Witcher series when it came to game mechanics, branching storylines, and the sheer scale of all the open-world elements, which actually broke what the Red game engine was originally designed to handle. Development time. While The Witcher 3 was developed over 4 years, Cyberpunk 2077 was in development for close to a decade, undergoing multiple revisions and scope changes. This longer development cycle could have led to outdated elements in the Red game engine, which then required quick fixes and workarounds that all probably compromised the performance. Cross-platform development. Cyberpunk 2077 was released on last-gen consoles like the PS4 and the Xbox One. But CDPR later revealed that they built the game with the performance of PCs and next-gen consoles in mind, because likely they discovered in the development and testing process that the Red game engine may not have been optimized sufficiently to also perform well on older platforms. Technical debt. The Cyberpunk codebase could have become increasingly complex as features were added or removed during its decade of development, leading to what is known in software development as technical debt. This made the game harder to debug and optimize and extend the system, which is extremely important to handle for a game as huge and complex as Cyberpunk 2077. Resource allocation. CD Projekt Red wasn't just focused on the development of the Cyberpunk game. They were also expanding their company locations, planning multiplayer features, producing the Cyberpunk Edge Runners animation series, and developing future expansions for Cyberpunk 2077. This clearly stretched the company's resources too thin and affected the quality of the final product. But after the Red game engine underperformed, CDPR is abandoning it to partner with Epic Games to build future titles exclusively on the Unreal Engine 5. Which raises the question, if transitioning to a new game engine was needed, then why wasn't it done sooner? And the problem is they only admitted to this after players already invested time and dollars into the base game's broken experience. This casts doubt on CDPR's technical capabilities and corporate transparency and responsibility. And by the way, CDPR switching from Red Engine to Unreal Engine 5 will also likely mean that all your progression in the Cyberpunk 2077 reboot and the Phantom Liberty expansion will once again be incompatible and non-transferable to all of CDPR's future content, making all your time and effort in the reboot and the expansion completely meaningless yet again. And this will undoubtedly divide the player base between those who can access the superior Unreal Engine 5 version and those stuck with the outdated version built on the Red Engine, which will likely further fragment and infuriate the gaming community. Number 2. A paywall to accountability, a financial misstep. After a disastrous launch of Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt Red reported a 75% drop in its stock value within 2 years of its original release. The company still managed to build a loyal player base by selling over 13.7 million copies at the end of 2020. Then 5.7 million more copies were sold in 2021. And in 2022, the sales skyrocketed to 11.6 million copies sold. And this was because CDPR started to stabilize the game, while continuing their aggressive marketing tactics to bring attention to all the new patches and hotfix updates. Plus, the popular Edge Runners anime series dropped on Netflix as an exclusive in September of 2022. So we know CDPR is no stranger to marketing hype, especially with the bombastic buzz they built that led up to the original release of the base game. But when the base game failed to meet expectations after its original release, the backlash was severe and the punishment was palpable, which definitely affected stock prices and consumer confidence like we discussed before. So CDPR's decision not to offer a new game plus for Phantom Liberty nor the 2.0 reboot not only loses more consumer trust, but also undermines the confidence of CDPR's global investors and stockholders who are looking for a financial windfall from the expansion and rebooted content. and is a publicly traded company. CD Projekt Red was under significant pressure to release the game and start recouping their investment before the Christmas holiday hit in 2020, which was one of the most challenging economic times in recent memory. So instead of waiting another 1 to 2 years to complete the development cycle, the top executives at CDPR decided to launch the unfinished original base game anyway. And after its release, the company went into damage control, promising significant post-launch content and improvements for the base game, which many interpreted to include features like a new Game Plus mode. So when this feature was absent from all the announcements and reports, existing Cyberpunk players felt CDPR was putting accountability for their past mistakes behind a paywall by asking players to pay again for an experience that should have been part of the original purchase. And if CDPR focused on a high retention rate, plus a higher replay value, they could achieve a 15 to 30% increase in overall sales for their new titles, according to a study by researchers from the University of Amsterdam. Meaning features like a new Game Plus mode could extend a game's lifecycle and increase long-term profitability, such as the 10-year-long run of Grand Theft Auto 5, which continues to generate millions of dollars a year for Rockstar, even though it was first released back in 2013. But New Game Plus can also affect the in-game economy. So, what if CDPR planned to unveil a microtransaction system that'll be connected to in-game purchases for Cyberpunk 2077, like customizable items, clothing, weapons, and enhancements? And if CDPR not only has avoided adding a New Game Plus mode, while also avoiding taking more steps to restore consumer trust and confidence, they're just nuking the possibility of players investing in future systems and titles, which could easily result in a substantial loss of potential revenue for a game that should have had at least a 10-year-long cycle of replayability. So I think you get the point. The long-term implications of this decision could be catastrophic for CD Projekt Red as a brand and as a business. And basically, players will be less likely to invest additional money into the game for things like items and weapons, enhancements, and future products and titles, which will continue to reduce the game's long-term value, making it less likely that players will invest in additional content or recommend the game to other players, which will affect the game's overall profitability, because players recognize that much of their time was invested in an earlier and flawed version of the game, which has now been rebranded as a stepping stone to the rebooted version of the base game. A base game players originally believed was finished when they purchased it back in December of 2020. Number 1. A moral obligation to loyal players. CD Projekt Red as a company had a moral obligation to the players who stuck with the game despite its issues, and it shouldn't be out of the question for CDPR to deliver the new Game Plus option in the Phantom Liberty expansion in the 2.0 reboot as a complimentary gift to the most loyal Cyberpunk players. Because we've all endured the 3 years of patchwork and PR statements, and the least the company can do is allow players to transfer their hard-earned progress into the new and rebooted content. Otherwise, it'll be like saying, thank you for sticking with us through thick and thin, through all the bugs, crashes, and broken promises. Then let the past be the past, including the past non-transferable character builds you invested all your time and effort on in the beta version of the game we sold you 3 years ago. And just go ahead and pay us more money to get the actual game we promised you originally. But now it's even better because it has cool new features and a cool new story to sweeten up the deal. And we can be pretty certain CDPR wouldn't want that type of narrative nor perception from the existing Cyberpunk players, but it seems they possibly aren't paying attention or simply don't care. And even though it's obvious that the Phantom Liberty expansion and the 2.0 reboot are impressive and technically superior to the original base game, it'll basically be a double-edged sword. So on one edge, the upgrades cut through the incomplete mechanics and the unfulfilled promises and the performance issues that plagued the original game. But on the other edge, the company and the upgrade sticks a rusty blade through the bond of trust and loyalty that players built with CD Projekt Red over the last couple of decades. And it all comes at a cost of ignoring the original sin of the base game's initial release. And the other cost is how existing players are being taxed for it, after they've invested considerable time and money into a product that was broken and incomplete. So this is about corporate responsibility and a moral obligation. So the decision of not adding a new Game Plus feature is a missed opportunity to rebuild confidence, trust, and goodwill. Although the patches and hotfixes were positive steps toward restoring confidence in Cyberpunk 2077 as a game, CD Projekt Red fails to recognize they'll have a lot more patchwork to do as a company brand in order to hotfix the broken trust with the gaming community. And a new Game Plus mode could have gone a long way to restoring their reputation as a reliable and trusted game developer. So, if you like this content and want more of it, Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell for the latest Cyberpunk 2077 news, secrets, leaks, and updates. Until next time, guys, keep raging.